John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. I'm going to read the passage and then we'll open up in a word of prayer. Some time later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. Verse 4, and they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease he had. Verse 5, one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" That should be highlighted here in your Bible. Verse 7, "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. Let's pray. Father, this is a perfect passage for us here tonight because I know that there are many here, myself and my family included, who can really identify with this passage. Some of us going through challenging times. Some of us can identify with the invalid and the others gathered around the pool because we know what hurt is like. We know what it's like to be broken. And there's some here tonight right in the middle of that. There's some who are here who on the precipice of experiencing a brokenness that they know nothing about right now. And there's some of us, Lord, who have placed our hope in you. Well, tonight you're going to show us the difference between a false hope and a living hope. You're going to show us, Lord, that all of us, whether we realize it or not, are just like the people gathered around the pool. And so show us your heart tonight, Jesus. Pour out your compassion because we need it. And for those that are here that are hurting, Lord, may their ears be opened and their hearts tender to what your Spirit has to say tonight. If there's any here that are unsaved, or they're the hurt people that you're reaching out to, and I pray that they would find help in their time of need, even tonight, that they would respond and that they would be born again. Have your way in our hearts this evening, Jesus. We love you and we thank you for being such a compassionate God. Amen. 1997, when I got saved in November, and I remember this vividly because in December, in fact, I got saved on the very last day of November. So December, going to church, brand new as a Christian, somebody in church came alongside of me and said, "Hey," after we got to talking and they heard a little bit of my story, just a little bit, he said, "Hey, you got to come with me to this meeting." And I didn't know what they were talking about, but they said, "You will find people there that are just like you. And it will really benefit you." I thought it was a Bible study. And so I said, "Okay, well," so they went to go pick me up. And what I found out was that it was an NA meeting. And at this NA meeting, Narcotics Anonymous, because they knew about my drug background, they thought that it would be a good thing for me to go. And so I didn't know anything. I was a brand new Christian. And so when I walked in, I immediately knew what it was. And I saw a lot of people. A lot of people that looked like they had no hope. And what I saw in that room was brokenness. I saw false hope. I saw people who were hurting. And even as a brand new Christian, I knew that I wasn't like these people. So I went, and then I remember standing up, and just like you see on TV, and they asked me to introduce myself, and it just felt really awkward. And then after a few minutes, I got up and then I left, and my friend followed me out and said, "Well, where are you going?" And I said, "I don't think this is for me. This is not for me." And I said, "Because I'm not like that anymore." I saw people in that room, and again, there were a lot of them, who were like what I used to be. Even as a brand new Christian, I understood that. But here's the second thing that I realized. That instead of being repulsed by them, my heart went out to them. My heart went out to them. These were people who were hurting just like I was before I got saved. And their hope is a false hope because their hope is in a methodology. Their hope was in a man-made thing. And tonight, in our passage, this is exactly what we see. Now, some of you may not have the same experience or even close to it that I've described about myself, and that's okay. But I want you to recognize that as we go through this passage, whether you get it or not, whether you realize it or not, these people and the multitudes, so it's not just a couple, it's in the hundreds. These people around the pools are just like you and me. What we need to do is make sure our hope is in the living hope, not a false hope. So let the Lord speak to your hearts tonight. Verse 1, sometime later. This is later after chapter 4. Remember when Jesus had just dealt with the noble man, the one who came from Capernaum all the way to Cana. And so now he's back in Jerusalem. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, because remember, Jerusalem, even if it's south geographically of Galilee, where Jesus is coming from, Jerusalem was on a hill. So every time they talked about going to Jerusalem, it's always up to Jerusalem, no matter what area you're coming from. Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. We don't know which feast, probably one of the main three. Now, there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Now, just a tiny bit of history here. I find this fascinating. For hundreds of years, this was one of the passages that skeptics of the Bible would use to say, archaeologically, the Bible has proven itself to be false. Why? Because there was no such place. There was no such pool. And it was in the late 1800s, I think 1898, a British archaeologist found a place with this name. But it was in the 60s where the excavation actually dug up the name and found these actual 5 colonnades. So this place existed long ago. It's a real place. This place is located here in verse 2 near the sheep gate. Now, if you're familiar with the map of Jerusalem, Jerusalem was surrounded by walls. And if you remember in Nehemiah chapter 3, Nehemiah's task was to go and rebuild the walls. Well, along the walls were gates. So every gate was stationed strategically with the surrounding walls. And so there would be a measure of wall, and then a gate, another measure of wall, and then another gate. Well, the sheep gate here would be in the northeast quadrant. If you're looking at a clock, it would be close to like 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. So when you're looking at the map of Jerusalem, the sheep gate would be in the top right. This would be the outer wall, the city wall. Now, the temple itself was also located in the northeast quadrant of Jerusalem. And the temple also had its own wall around the temple court area. So the sheep gate here would be on the outside wall, and it was named so because this is where the shepherds' flocks would be kept outside. They would use this gate to let the sheep in, and then there would be another opening into the temple area right by the sheep gate, because these were the sheep they would use for temple sacrifice. Now, this is important because if you notice, and I don't think this is by accident, if you notice in Nehemiah's 3rd chapter, when he talks about going through the walls step by step for the rehabilitation and the establishment of the security of Jerusalem, that's what his job was, because the walls were torn down, there was no security. He was sent back to rebuild the walls. He starts and he ends at the sheep gate. This is a picture of Jesus. Everything starts and ends with Jesus. So keep that in mind here. Verse 3. Oh, forgot one more thing. So near the pool here, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and this is where the 5 colonnades were. So Bethesda is the name of that area. The Jewish name really means house of mercy. Beth, you know, means house. Isda is the word for mercy. Now, keep that in the back of your mind. Bethesda is called the house of mercy. Verse 3. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. Now, I'm going to stop here before we get into verse 4. I read verse 4, and some of you following along, if you're using NIV, were probably thinking, where are you? Because it's not in my Bible. It jumps right to verse 5. It's probably in your footnotes, and the easy explanation is because the older texts, which the NIV and some of the modern translations use, the Alexandrian manuscripts, do not have verse 4. The Textus Receptus, the one that the King James is based upon, uses manuscripts that do have verse 4. It doesn't change the story, it doesn't change the meaning, but that's why you'll see some manuscripts don't include this in your footnotes. However, I don't think it hurts or adds to the story, but there is something important that I want you to see, which is why I included verse 4. But verse 3 first. What we see here, starting in verse 3, really in verse 3, 4, and 5, we see people who are broken. People who are broken. They're broken by 3 things. One in verse 3, one in verse 4, one in verse 5. We'll look at these quickly. But these 3 things are all sources of brokenness. And each one of these 3 we can identify with today. So let's look at them slowly. Verse 3, a great number of disabled people used to lie down there, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. Now what we see here is people broken by physical hurt. Their bodies are hurting. But I would include in this emotional, mental hurt. There's people here described in verse 3 whose bodies are sick. We've all experienced some type of physical illness to some degree. And if you remember, when you're sick, it not only doesn't feel good, but it's so much easier to give in to other kinds of attacks. Your mind gives in to thoughts that you normally wouldn't think when your body isn't well. And what I want you to see here is that there are people in our story just like people here today. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's people that you know. We go through physical illness. We go through sickness. And these things can break us down. Some of us here tonight are hurting physically. And I want you to know that the power to heal is here. Healing is not guaranteed to us, but the Bible tells us to ask for it. It may be God's will. But the people here in verse 3 are hurt. They're hurt physically. They're hurt emotionally. And we can identify with that. The second thing we see is in verse 4. I'll read it again. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool, after each such disturbance, would be cured of whatever disease he had. The second thing we get hurt by is superstition and religion. Now, what's described here, it's definitely true that this is what they believed. What we don't know is true is if it really happened. Maybe it did. But it's likely a superstition, a religion. These are people that were gathered around a pool and pools. And their hope was in something they had no evidence of. At least the Bible doesn't tell us that there's evidence of it. Now, there's evidence of the fact that they believed it. But just because you believe something doesn't mean it's true. That's why when we believe in superstitious things, when we put our hope in astrology and zodiac signs, fortune cookies, or whatever it is you do, whatever people do, and it seems innocuous and it seems innocent, it's what the world does, and most people think, well, hey, you know what? I don't really believe it, but, just in case. That kind of thinking, whether you realize it or not, is false hope. Because you're thinking about, okay, I have faith in Jesus, but you know what? It doesn't hurt to add other stuff to it. I don't really put my faith in that stuff. Yes, you do. Because if you pay attention to it, it means you put hope in it, at least a little bit. Same thing with religion. I come, many of you know, from a Catholic upbringing, just like many of you. And as a Catholic person, all I was taught was, this is what you do. You don't ask why you do it, but it's what your parents did, it's what your grandparents did, it's what we've always done, so don't ask any questions. Just do it. Now, in our particular culture, the Filipino culture is very similar to Hispanic culture in the sense that Catholicism is intertwined with the culture. So if you're a Filipino, you're assumed to be Catholic. Just like many of you who are Hispanic, it's assumed to be Catholic. But putting your hope in any kind of religion, including Catholicism, is a false hope. I remember when I first got saved, because every single person in my family and all of my relatives were Catholic, I heard the same thing over and over, just like you did. When I would tell people, I'm born again, I got saved, they would wave their hand at me and say, oh, you were born Catholic, you will die Catholic. They had no clue what they're talking about. Because that's what happens when you put your hope in religion, when you put your hope in superstitious things. It breaks you because you realize at some point, this doesn't help me. It doesn't matter how many prayers you pray. It doesn't help you. It doesn't make God listen to you more. It doesn't matter how many good luck charms you collect. It's not going to help you. It doesn't matter how many, coins you toss in the fountain. It's not going to help you. And when we put our hope in things like this, we reach a point where we realize, this didn't work. And it breaks you. It breaks you. These are people who are broken by physical hurt. These are people broken by superstition and religion. Verse 5. This one's also heartbreaking. It says, one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. That's a long time. They were broken by hurt. They were broken by superstition and religion. And here we see this man was broken by time. By time. You see, suffering over time wears you out. It wears the body out. It can wear your spirit out. And what we see here is a picture in verse 5 of this one person that's singled out. He was there, and he had been an invalid, meaning he was crippled. He could not move. If he was itchy, he could not scratch it. If he was thirsty, he could not get a drink. If he had to go to the bathroom, he could not get up and go. He would have to go where he's at. And he was like this for a very long time, 38 years. Now, I don't think there's a particular significance to the number of years other than just to show that it was a very long time. And if we're talking about people who are broken, in this state of brokenness, this is what time will do to us. Many of us understand what it feels like to be worn out over time, to be tired, to be exhausted. If your bodies have been worn out, if you've been sick for a while, it's one thing. But to be sick for an extended amount of time, it's completely different. But then you make this, or you add to this years upon years, and in this case, almost 4 decades. This man has been suffering. Time takes its toll. So don't believe when people say little cliche things like, time heals all wounds. It gets better with time. It actually gets worse. We can sweep it under the rug and time will pass by, but it does not get better over time. And in this case, this man was hurt, and he was hurting for a long, long time. Now, all that to describe the people, this person, that we can identify with because they're broken. We know what it's like to be broken. Now, let's move on to Jesus, verse 6. We see broken people, now we see a broken heart. Verse 6 says, when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? We'll stop here at this verse because now Jesus enters the picture. And Jesus singles out this one man. I mean, many people think, well, Jesus, there's hundreds of people here that are sick, maybe even some worse off than this one man. Why him? Why not everybody else? Why not just wave your hand and heal everybody? Well, we'll learn later on in this chapter that Jesus doesn't do anything unless the Father tells him. And so the Spirit led him to this one man. Now, I don't want you to get discouraged. I want you to be encouraged by this. Because what we're going to see about this one man is what Jesus sees about you. Look at this. When Jesus saw him lying there, this phrase, saw him lying there, is important. Because the scriptures go out of its way to describe how Jesus' eyes were locked in on this person. He was like a racehorse with blinders. And yes, there were people all around, hundreds upon hundreds, but it was this one person that he was locked in on. And I want you to know this. In your suffering, he's locked in on you. He is looking right at you. It says here that Jesus saw him lying there. He saw him lying there. In Luke chapter 7, there is a story that only Luke records among all the Gospels. And there in verse 13, starting in verse 11, I think, Luke talks about how Jesus was walking and came across a procession, a funeral procession. And in this funeral procession, he realized that there was a widow who was mourning the death of her only son. Now listen to that. A widow, which means she lost her husband, who was mourning the death. They were carrying the body, the coffin of her only son. She literally had nobody else. And in that passage there in Luke chapter 7, it says that when Jesus came across this procession and there's people crying, he focused in on the widow, just like he focused in on this man. And it says there in Luke chapter 7 that Jesus made his way to her because his heart went out to her. It says that his heart went out to her and he said to her, "Don't cry." How could you not cry? This lady has lost everything. But he said to her, "Don't cry." And as the story goes, Jesus raises her son to be alive again. But the key I want you to focus on is that phrase, same thing here. Jesus, his heart went out to her. Remember when Jesus went to the tomb of Lazarus and it says that he wept. Why did he weep? Because his heart was broken. When we suffer, I want you to hear this. When we suffer, he's focused in on you like a racehorse with blinders. He's not paying more attention to somebody else's suffering. He's looking at you. He sees you. He makes his way to you because he loves you. He is compassionate towards the hurting. One of the verses in the Psalms that I lean upon often, and I think I mentioned it last study, but it's Psalm 46. The very first verse there, now the context of that psalm is about the world falling apart. But we learn it's not going to fall apart because God is the one that's holding it together. He's going to hold it together until he comes. But that first verse says that God, you are our refuge and our defense. You are our hope. You are our ever-present hope in time of trouble. And I want you to know that today. Because what the enemy tries to do when we're like these people who are hurt, broken over time, broken by religion, what the enemy does is he capitalizes on that and says, God doesn't love you. You're all alone. Nobody has it as bad as you do. And I want you to know tonight that in the same way that Jesus saw him lying there, he sees you lying in your pain. This meant so much to me personally. I mentioned in December when I went to that NA meeting. Well, just a few days prior, November 30th, when I got saved that night, it was so profound to me that as I walked into this room for the first time, never been to a Christian church. I told you before, I was struck by the size and everything, but I sat down, everybody stood singing, and one of the things that the God began to pierce my heart with is, as he was talking to me, I knew he was talking directly to me. And even if I tried to look like everything was okay, he knew how much I was hurting inside. He knows how much you're hurting inside. That's what moved me to give my life to him, because he knew my brokenness. It says here, the rest of verse 6, Jesus learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, and he asked him, do you want to get well? I would add this, do you want to really get well? Jesus is asking you this question here tonight. Whether it's physical sickness, whether it's mental or emotional, whatever your pain and your suffering is, whatever your hurt is, he's already told you. He sees it. He sees you. And he's asking you, do you really want to get well? Now, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed healing. But let's look at what he says. He asked him, do you really want to get well? Now, this is a sick man who's been an invalid for 38 years. I think it's pretty obvious. But Jesus doesn't ask a question because he doesn't know the answer. Jesus asked the question because he wants this man to really think about his answer. He's asking you the same thing. You see, in our suffering, we think, God, if you would just fix this one thing, just fix this one thing, I'll be okay. Again, for me that night, I had my own thing. I remember telling God that night, in the middle of that Bible study, I remember saying in my mind, if you're real, then all I want is just to be normal. I knew I wasn't normal. I needed to take drugs to act like I was normal. And so I said, God, if you're real, just make me normal. That's all I want. And then he asked me the same question. It's not about the drugs. That's easy. But do you want to be well? Do you really want to be well? The question he asked me that night was this. It's not about the drugs. He said, are you tired of the pain? Are you tired of the pain in your life? The pain that I caused? Are you tired of being miserable? You see, I had always thought that I can get out of any difficult situation. Like many of you think the same way or used to think the same way. But I reached a point in my life where I couldn't. And he would ask me, are you tired of the pain? Now for me, because I knew I was tired of it, yes. When I counsel people that are in that same situation, I ask them the same question, but here's what I hear back sometimes. Here's what you hear back sometimes. Pastor Ken, I'm really messed up. I'm really messed up. I think that's pretty obvious. But the reason why that doesn't answer any questions is in verse 7. Look at verse 7. After Jesus asks him a very honest and direct question, here is his response. This is a response of false hope. This is what it looks like. Jesus, with his broken heart, asks him a question, and his response is, Sir. The invalid replied, I have no one to help me. I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. Now, what do you notice about his answer? He doesn't answer the question Jesus asks. He asks him a yes or no question. But the man goes on to explain in detail why he can't be fixed. But I want you to see this. Verse 7 is a picture of what his false hope is in. Notice this. He says, "Sir," the first thing he mentions is, "I have no one to help me." No one to help me. These two things are really one thing in which he's putting his hope in. He's putting his hope in people. If you put your hope in people, it's a false hope. People will let you down. Even people who love you will let you down. So what do you expect when you put your hope in people? If you put your hope in your spouse, you will be let down. If you put your hope in your brother, your sister, your parents, you will be let down. Why? Because we're human. Even if it's unintentional, we will disappoint one another. That's why we can't put our hope in each other. Now, does that mean you abandon all hope? No, but you can't put all of your hope in people. That's what we do, though. We do that to our family. We do that to our spouse. And it isn't until you realize that they let you down when you realize you put your hope in them. I tell people in marital counseling all the time, look, if your spouse's disobedience causes you to disobey God, that means you're closer to your spouse than you are to Jesus. That means your hope is in your spouse, not in Jesus. But if you're closer to Jesus than even to your spouse, then you will be able to minister to your spouse no matter what your spouse does. He put his hope in people, and let's continue. "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred." The second thing he put his false hope in was in circumstances. Circumstances. He says here, look, I'm just waiting for the water to be stirred. That was his circumstance. And he couldn't get there. His hope was in the circumstances getting better. If you are one that's happier when your bank account is full, and you are sad when your bank account is not full, then that's a pretty good indicator that your hope is in your money. If you are grouchy when things don't go your way, but you are happy when things go your way, then that's a good indicator that your hope is in your circumstances. If you are loving to others when they are loving to you, but you are offended easily by people when they are offensive to you, then that's an indicator that your hope is in your circumstances. And you can easily blame these things. Well, you know what, if that didn't happen, if he didn't say that, if my paycheck went through, if this bill didn't come, all that could be true. But still, it shows that your hope is in these circumstances. And let me tell you, if that's you, you have a false hope. It's not okay to have a false hope. It's not okay to your family. It's not okay to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus says, put all of your hope in me. The rest of the verse says, in verse 7, while I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. Look at that phrase, I am trying. The third thing that he puts his false hope in is himself. I'm trying my best. It's just not working out. The reason why he has a false hope is because he's trusting in himself. Now, this is crazy. He's an invalid. He has no capacity to move. And it's been this way for decades. But yet, he still puts his hope in himself. And we look at that, we think, you're crazy. What are you thinking? But we're the same way. We're the exact same way. We get really upset when we can't do something ourselves. When you know it was something you couldn't do in the first place. It's like walking over to the bench press at the gym and stacking it with 4 plates on each side and going to bench press it and getting really upset that you can't do it. Well, I mean, maybe you can, but I can't. So it's like me do. Why would I be disappointed? Well, because in my mind, I actually thought that I could do it. Now, that's an extreme example, but the truth is we think the same way. I could fix him. I could fix her. No, you can't. You can't fix anything. You can't even fix yourself. How are you going to fix somebody else? I could make this relationship work. No, you can't. If you put your hope in yourself, you have a false hope. Verse 8 and 9, the last part, and here we'll close. This is a picture of our living hope. Then Jesus said to him, "Get up. Pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. I'm going to stop there and then we'll close with the last part of this verse. This is a contrast to verse 7 because verse 7, the man gave every excuse of his why he had false hope. He described everything that he put his false hope in. And Jesus is saying, put your hope in me. And that's why he says, get up. In those short 2 words, he's saying, I'm not even listening to your excuses. I'm telling you, get up. He had a decision to make. Am I going to believe him? He didn't even listen to my excuses. He didn't even listen to my reasoning. But he said, get up. I've been trying to get up for 38 years. But it says here that Jesus continues, pick up your mat. Don't just get up, but pick up your mat and walk. Verse 9 says, at once. At once. You see, the living hope is Jesus Christ. And it's him we put our faith in. This is a living hope. We put our faith in the living hope. This man put his faith in a false hope. So when Jesus said, get up, he was effectively saying, are you going to put your faith in that false thing, or are you going to put your faith in me? I'll give you a chance to demonstrate it. Get up. And it says, at once, the man was cured. There was, look at this, an inner change. It wasn't the outward change. It was an inner change of faith that took place. That's what has to happen first. Your faith can't be in circumstances. Your faith can't be in healing. Your faith can't be in finances. Your faith can't be in your spouse or your family. All these things are false hope. But Jesus says, put your faith in me. Don't worry about if it doesn't happen. Put your faith in me. Let me take care of the results. This man heard that, and at once he was cured because he responded by faith internally. Now look at the rest of the verse. He picked up his mat and walked. What do you see here? Internal change leads to outward obedience. Internal change. By faith, he believed Jesus at his word, just like we learned last week. The man took Jesus at his word. And then followed with outward obedience. You can't just say, I believe you, Jesus, and do nothing. This is why James would say, and I got a show on the radio, I got a question on the radio show today about this, but you can't say, I have faith in you, Jesus, but do nothing. Why? Because faith has legs, there's got to be some action that follows it up. Because if you just say with your mouth that you have faith, but your life doesn't change, it means you really don't believe. Well, here, this man had a real inward change. So it was followed up naturally. This is a natural byproduct of an inward change, which is an outward obedience. So he picked up his mat and walked. And we'll close with this last part. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath. Now, we'll talk about this again next time, but I want you to think about this. This is the house of mercy that this is taking place. And God here says, I'm going to demonstrate to you mercy and grace. We know that the Sabbath, according to Hebrews chapter 4, isn't something that we obey on the seventh day because we don't follow the law. But Hebrews chapter 4 tells us that Jesus is our Sabbath. Every single day is a day of rest with Jesus. There's work, but we're always at rest with Jesus, which allows us to do the work. You see, this man finally realized on the Sabbath day that all of his striving he can now rest from, because his rest is in Jesus. Some of you need to know that tonight. You've been striving and trying really hard, even to the point where you've lost hope. You're like the people gathered around the pool, and over time, being broken, being physically hurt, being emotionally hurt, you're on the verge of giving up. And in the same way that I walked into this room and saw all these people in the NA meeting, and I realized my heart hurts for them. Jesus saw me, and he made his way to me, just like he's making his way to you tonight. Whatever it is you need, whatever it is you're hurting from, let tonight be the night. Doesn't matter what's happened in the past. Let tonight be tonight that a compassionate and loving God fixes his eyes upon you, and you let him heal your heart. And let's see what he does with your life. Let's pray.